say you have a cake and you cut it in, you have two identical cakes, but you cut them into different number of pieces, okay? So we take a cake and we cut it into 3 pieces. We take a cake that's the same size, we cut it into 8 pieces. The child is going to say that the cake with 8 pieces has more cake in it unless he or she has mastered conservation. Conservation helps the child understand the concept of volume and reversibility. So now the child understands unit, volumes, and again the concept of reversibility and what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes and understand their viewpoint. Stage number 4, formal operations from ages 11 to 12 to about 15. A great memory device here is that you can remember that as people get older, they usually become more formal, hence the formal operations stage or operational stage will be the last stage. Formal operations is the beginning of abstract, hypothetical, and deductive reasoning. The child learns the concept of experimentation with problems and begins to understand metaphors. Formal operations allow some adolescents to tackle subjects like algebra. I say some because Piaget and some other researchers believe that only 50% of all adults ever make it to Piaget's final stage. Even Piaget admitted that bright adults could sometimes only use formal operations in their own field. For example, some physics majors who are experts in internal combustion engines might be incapable of changing their own spark plugs. Some research revealed that only 15 to 25% of college students ever use formal operational thinking. Most experts agree that Piaget did little to discuss the application of his ideas to the counseling session. Some have suggested that the child's cognitive level, rather than his or her chronological age, should be used to determine is the name in cognitive development. Then Lawrence Kohlberg, born in 1927, is the name in moral development. Lawrence Kohlberg was a graduate student in the 1950s at the University of Chicago, and he studied Piaget. Piaget had set forth a 2-stage theory of morality, and in 1958, Kohlberg wrote a dissertation on this, and he went on to say that he felt Piaget's theory just didn't have enough depth, so he created his own theory. Piaget's theory of moral development talked about heteronymous morality or moral realism, which is where you do the right thing due to parents, teachers, etc. The word hetero means other. Piaget also had a stage 2, autonomous, be altered or adjusted. Kohlberg actually believed, after he researched these Piagetian moral stages, that there are actually 3 levels of morality, and each has 2 stages. Now remember this, for Kohlberg, morality is a decision and not a trait. The first level of morality, approximately ages 2 to 7, is called pre-conventional morality. At this level, consequences dictate feelings. Again, morality. Behavior is guided by punishment and rewards. Stage 1 is what is known as an obedience and reward orientation. Here, the fear of punishment is strong. Stage 2 is what is known as instrumental exchange, where the child is motivated by reward. Level 2 is known as conventional morality. Here you try to meet the standards of the family, your nation, and your culture. You identify with people in power. You try to live up to a socially Stage 3 occurs in level 2, and it's what we call the good boy, good girl orientation. Here you do the right thing to please others and get recognition. There is also Stage 4 in this level, or what is called law and order, or social authority, order orientation. Then there's level 3, which is what is known as post-conventional or self-imposed morality. This is the highest level. Here the person acts on principles rather than rules, and thus it is sometimes called a prior to society viewpoint. The person has a self-accepted standard of behavior. Stage 5 is called the social morality of contract, and here the person wants to maintain respect with equals in the community. Stage 6 is what we call universal ethical principle of conscience. In this highest stage, there is concern over self-condemnation over violating one's principles, and of course some never reach stages 5 and 6. In stage 6, you are concerned with equal rights of all people. Okay, now I know that Kohlberg seemed a little complex, but there's plenty of review in my material. Most experts agree that Now let's look at the concept of conservation. If you have two... Now, as I talk about these stages in people... Okay, now I want to talk, interestingly enough, Piaget has been criticized because he did most of his research on his own children. Some people say that he was a bit informal in terms of doing that. Piaget has been categorized as what we call a structuralist. That is to say, he believed that there are universal stages of psychological development, and that each stage represents a qualitative difference in the way a person thinks or solves a conflict. He has also been called a universal constructivist. Simply put, the stages of development are universal, and the child literally constructs his or her cognitive development. Heredity is responsible for programming the unfolding of the stages. The way a strive for equilibration between the two. Okay? Or what actually Piaget called this equilibration, but the average person would just call it equilibrium. Simply put, folks, equilibration is the balance of assimilation and accommodation in a new situation. To review, when a child uses his or her existing understanding of the world to make sense out of the environment, that's assimilation. When the child changes his or her previous ways of knowing the world to make sense out of the new information, that's accommodation. Now, the bedrock of Piaget's theory rests on his 4 orderly stages of development. 1. The sensory motor stage. 2. The pre-operational stage. 3. The concrete operational stage. And 4. The formal operational stage. Let's dissect these stages one by one, remembering that Piaget relied on case studies, often using his own children, to verify his theory. Now, as I talk about these stages in Piaget's theory, remember that Piaget considered himself the founder of a new discipline that he called genetic epistemology. Now, epistemology is just a big fancy schmancy word. That means the philosophy of the nature of knowledge. So again, Piaget called himself a genetic epistemologist. Stage number 1, the sensory motor intelligence stage. From birth until approximately 2 years. This stage is categorized by lots of reflexive behavior, such as sucking or grasping. Piaget called it sensory motor since the emphasis is on the senses, especially touch, vision, and motor, because there is an emphasis on motor activities such as sucking or grasping, as I mentioned earlier. Now, an important concept in this first sensory motor stage is what is known as object permanence. It occurs between the 9th and 12th month. Here the child discovers object permanence, which is the ability to recognize that an object still exists even when it is out of reach and out of sight. Before the child masters object permanence, which would occur, of course, before the 9th month, if you place a toy behind the child no longer reaches for it. This is what some would call out of sight, out of mind. To review, a child who has mastered object permanence knows that something exists even when it is out of sight. For test purposes, remember that object permanence could also be called symbolic or representational thought. With object permanence comes the concepts of causality in space. So, for example, a child learns that a hand causes a toy to move from one space to another. And lastly, the child learns time. That is to say, that